Well, if you think about Disney Plus, and it's relatively new. I mean, that launched in November 2019 at the perfect time, really just ahead of when the pandemic hit and shuttered theaters in North America, at least in March of 2020. So they were well positioned to start putting their content out on the Disney Plus platform. Though it's interesting, with the 45-day theatrical window, I think we've seen that plays well, that the theatrical first model is the good way to go, generally speaking, if you want to build that big box office. Plus, theatrical builds prestige and exclusivity so that when those films hit the streaming service, they are more embraced and more sought after, I think, by the consumer. Now, with Black Widow, of course, very famously, there's issues going on there with some saying, and certainly Scarlett Johansson's camp saying that by having the day and date release, it hurt the film's potential box office. And if you look at the numbers, you have to say sometimes that bears out, sometimes not. It depends on the movie. It's a very complicated situation with all these movies and really all the studios, including, of course, Disney, trying to figure out what is the best strategy for each and every one of their movies.
It's always been a factor in the industry that the movie has enough appeal that people bother to go to the cinema and buy the popcorn and sit there and watch the movie versus waiting for it to be released in some other form, whether it was video back in the day or in a streaming service these days. But now it's a different fact as we talk about people waiting at home and not willing to pay that extra to access the early release on streaming. What's the magic source here for these companies to try and get it right so they get either the in-ticket sales at the theatre or they get the money paid up front on the streaming service for the early release?
Well, that's the multi-million or billion-dollar question, and I think every studio is trying to figure that out. What I've seen in my experience that a theatrical first with a dynamic window, meaning that if a film isn't playing as well as was expected over the ensuing weeks after its opening weekend, then keeping it in a theater doesn't do the theaters any good. They want to get new content in to drive people into the theater. But if it's a movie that's a blockbuster, I mean, you take Furious 9, for example. Now, of course, that's a Universal picture. That's up to $661 billion worldwide, million dollars worldwide. And so that is a huge number for that film. And even though Furious 9 dropped 67% in its second weekend, Black Widow dropped about the same 68%. The films that are only available in theater in the second, third, and fourth week, people have to go to the theater to see them. But streaming is a great play as well. For some movies, that's a great option, but I still think theatrical first, even if it's a shorter window. I think that's a really good play going forward. I think obviously that day and date model was accelerated by the pandemic. The adoption of that model was accelerated by the pandemic. And Disney Plus, though, well-positioned, considering the library of titles, also the new titles. Shang-Chi is coming up, and I think that one is going to be a big movie. That's going to be another big test. I think Chapek noted that that will be an interesting experiment of the 45-day window, and Disney has Free Guy from 20th Century opening this weekend, and that's theatrical first. That'll be another interesting experiment to see what plays best with the consumer.